This episode was originally a live stream that took place on May 21st, 2026. This is potentially the biggest European AI exit, not only of this year, but probably like forever.
We had conversations with everybody and multiple offers on the table. Maximum you will get from us is a middle finger, but not a direction change.
Welcome to the Swisspreneur Show, a podcast about startup stories and learnings from experienced entrepreneurs. If you enjoy listening to our show, make sure to follow the podcast and leave a rating. And now, here's your host, Sylvan.
Hello, and very warm welcome. Dennis, so good to see you again. Thank you for spending some time with us today. A warm welcome.
Always happy to.
So I want to start with a little bit of context. So today I want to talk, of course, from Linz to Frontier, or the Emmi AI and Mistral deal that happened this week. So I think it's a very unique moment, not only for you, but also for Europe or for the whole ecosystem, because Mistral AI, Europe's answer to OpenAI, just announced that it's acquiring Emmi AI on Tuesday this week, an Austrian startup that was just founded 18 months ago out of JKU Linz. And it's not a small story, because this is potentially the biggest European AI exit, not only of this year, but probably like forever, at least for now. And you are the co-founder and CEO of the company. You have left your marks in the Swiss startup ecosystem with Knip, with Small PDF. And it's just so cool to have you here and to really dive a bit deeper behind the numbers, the story and everything. Dennis, let's dive right in, okay?
Yes, go ahead. Grill me.
Okay, let's go. Well, to give people a bit more context. So last time when we talked, you were building, obviously. And now we see the results of what you have been building. So this week on Tuesday, you woke up and Mistral has announced it's acquiring your company. What did that morning or that day feel like when everything became public?
That's a good one. I mean, I'm not sure if this is about me being too rational, but I mean, it's, even in financing rounds or now after the acquisition, like that, honestly, the feeling doesn't change much, because I'd say the journey is not over, and you still, I mean, at least for me, that's the case. You still reflect of how much has to be done kind of going forward, right? So maybe to set it into perspective, right? So we signed the deal last week. I mean, obviously, I think the signing, because we did 2-night stints to get this over the line, was draining, but very fulfilling. At the same time, in these M&A deals, after signing, it's not done. So you have to basically close. You need to go get statutory approvals for the deal. All of the employees have to be shifted, etc. pp. So in my head, the focus is now on closing. And at the same time, obviously, I think it feels great, and it's a great recognition for the work that we're doing as entrepreneurs and as a team, and specifically feeling grateful for the team. But I haven't had mental time to say, settling down. We haven't even had a closing dinner. We haven't had kind of a founders, beers, because we're in 3 locations with Linz, Vilnius, and Berlin. So I think it's, for us, the focus is now on, okay, it's announced, it's signed, some work needs to be done. Happy to go to the detail of how the structure kind of works. And I think in 2-3 weeks, I will be mentally at a point where I'm like, okay, this chapter over, next chapter there. So let's go right in. Because ultimately, and I think this may be answering some of the questions preemptive and knowing what you'll answer. So this whole thing is a big bet on a Mistral IPO for us, right? So obviously it's kind of a mix of cash and share deal, and it's a nice outcome for all the investors and for us. But specifically for us as a founders, we're committing to the path within Mistral and kind of pushing Mistral as a frontier lab, basically building from Europe for the world. So I think maybe that's why mentally it's not like, okay, it's over now and you can rest and it's an exit, but it's more like, okay, next chapter, it's there. Everybody got his fair share of success, but there's more to come.
It's a bit like after the game is before the game in that sense, right?
But it's, I think it's like building a new company. It feels a bit like, right? So I think you never settle or never really rest. I mean, obviously you need rest periods in between, but it's a little bit how it mentally feels.
I want to go a bit back before you actually co-founded Emmi AI. You have German roots, but you also left many nice big marks in the Swiss startup ecosystem with Knip, with Small PDF. When you decided to actually leave Switzerland, what were you trying to figure out at that point? Where were you? Because you then ended up in Linz and still Berlin, obviously. But at what point were you when you sort of left the Swiss ecosystem?
I'm not sure if you can say that. I mean, I still have close ties, right, to Switzerland, serving Acodis as chairman, etc. So I think for me, whatever I'm doing, so I'm never really planning things, but I'm trying to smell and look for opportunities. And I think what was somewhat clear after I operationally left Small BDF and then helped a little bit in the 3VC portfolio to clean things up in this kind of post COVID mess and SaaS turmoil, if you want to say it this way, was I think the big change going forward for me will happen in deep tech, because all of the optimizations on the platform front, or now you say kind of AI layer, right? However you call it ultimately, I think the big levers are done. And I think this is what I wouldn't say SaaS is over, because there's still a lot of very successful SaaS companies, but this more front-end focused point solutions, they change massively. And the only way how to change this is to own the core technology. And 3VC had, I mean, they're coming out of the Austrian ecosystem, right? They have close ties to Linz and the JKU. And they introduced me to Johannes and Sepp Hochreiter, who was one of the AI, I don't know, corifees of Europe, I think right before Emmi, basically with a hint of, hey, something is happening there. Just have a look, talk to these guys, get a feeling for what's happening. And this was a bit kind of, I mean, I studied economics and engineering, so I have a bit of a feeling for mechanical engineering, but I'm far away from being kind of a top tier software engineer or even an ML engineer. But I think the first discussions I had with both were remarkable in a sense of what they think they were capable to do and what they showed they are capable to do. Right. And I think then, as with every journey, it's about committing. Yeah. So you have a feeling of, hey, something is happening there and it looks like a good opportunity. There is amazing tech, but productization, packaging, scaling, team building, company building, like maybe not there. So why not, jump in, commit, and try to, build a stellar company? I think this is what ultimately happened over the last 2 years.
And they probably chose the best guy for that job to be their partner along the journey.
I don't know. I mean, the ending is not there, right? But I think the stint now that we're having, I think ended well, I must admit. But needless to say that it's I mean, no business building is an easy journey, right? So you start with hypotheses that don't come together. You have to adjust. You work too much. You defocus on family. So I think you have to eat this, and you eat it for an opportunity that you see, and then an outcome that you chase, if you want to say it this way. But there's never an end.
Right. And you went from founding the company and really putting in all this hard work to exit in basically 18 months. That's incredibly fast. Take us back through these 18 months. How were you able to get to that exit so fast? What were you focusing on? What were sort of the proof points, the milestones that you hit along the way to say, okay, we're now already ready for the exit in such a short time?
Yeah, maybe. So taking a step back and explaining in a minute what we do, which then helps a bit better to understand kind of what we focused on. So Johannes has a background at Microsoft and at JKU and is one of the key figures in, let's say, tokenizing physics and making deep learning or neural networks understand physical behaviors and replicate physical behaviors. And he started 5 years ago in weather modeling, which was the first like physical frontier, even before robotics, if you want to say it this way, where we've seen kind of a GPT-like breakthrough, that AI models actually are now more capable, way faster, and way more accurate to predict weather going forward. And I think we've been very much inspired from weather modeling and what he has been doing there. It's a relatively, I don't want to discount, a relatively simple problem because the Earth doesn't change. Right? The Earth is always the Earth in terms of the geometry, and you have a lot of data. All of the weather stations in the world measure data. There are a lot of curated data sources out there, which makes it, I wouldn't say easy, but it makes it the first problem that people focus on when they want to prove scalable physics AI or world models on a problem. At the same time, weather is a very small market, right? So for trading, it's relevant. Obviously for, solar, for example, it's relevant. For weather stations or weather forecasting is relevant, but the use case compared to, I think, the impact you can drive in, for example, the industry is relatively small. So what we basically started with is the hypothesis that we can drive we believe that we are capable to create the same GPT moment in the industry that beforehand we're capable to ultimately create in weather modeling. And we've been doing this by really focusing on fundamental research in creating our own AI architectures, modeling frameworks that allow us to train our own like end-to-end models for physical problems that the world kind of needs, right? And specifically industrial companies need. So started with aerodynamics, have now fluid dynamic kind of problems out there as well, kind of focused as well on stresses or everything around crash testing. And so when we started the company, we raised a 15 million seed round with the hypothesis we build the best AI lab in the world for industrial AI. Point. Well, in industrial AI, there are different definitions of it, really means industrial engineering, right? So everybody who produces a product, like a big, important product, we want to be able that they are capable to produce them faster and better. My point. That's it. So we raised the 15 million. We obviously got a big cluster. We hired the first people, but we tried to stay lean as an organization and focus on solving problems for customers ultimately that are big and that are obviously are willing to pay a lot for the value that we create. And I'd say luck that we had at the beginning is that our marketing mechanism, which was very different from what I did before, was papers. So we've basically, the way how we've built a recognition of being the leading world lab for industrial engineering is we published the most groundbreaking research in the field on problems that were never solved before, ultimately, right? And then the idea was if people have the same problem, and most of R&D research organizations look at papers for kind of solutions for that problem, they will come to us, right? Emmi is the name on the paper. Johannes is the one who publishes, is the same for the team. And this actually worked right from the back. So we've published what we call Universal Physics Transformer. So it's basically our hypothesis on how you tokenize and scale deep learning networks on transformer architecture for physics, which is one of the most cited papers, I think, in the world on the topic at the moment. And by this alone, we got like 15 inbounds from all of the big companies. Because it doesn't matter if it's, Hitachi, aerospace, defense, or semiconductor companies, they all try to accelerate the engineering process, ultimately. And from that, we basically got Siemens Energy as our first customer, which by then, we're super lucky, was a $1 million contract that we signed, which made it rather easy because we've been ultimately profitable in the first month to then raise a seed round and go attack other problems from there. So I think kudos to Siemens Energy to trust us on that. But it's really, we basically built a research-led organization, and we tried to respect, I would say, this research-led approach in go-to-market. It comes with problems at the same time. Happy to shed light on this one as well, why we then decided to partner with Mistral. But this was the whole story of, one, you want to be recognized as the leader in the field, and then two, you use it partly to ultimately acquire the leads in the pipeline that you want.
That's so impressive. It also sounds a bit like one of the potentially new ways to build a company, to start a company. It's a bit a different way than you might be used to before, to say, okay, we have to raise a lot of money, do a lot of marketing and build a sales team, etc. You did it in a very different way. Do you think that this is sort of a model that other founders should also think about if they have the research power in-house?
I think it's a very valid model from my perspective. I mean, there is as well the model of you get the biggest names in the research industry. I mean, look at Emmi as an example, right? Or Cast with Max and Jan, raise $1 billion and then build something on top. But I think I must admit, it's a different equity story that you work on, right? Because if you raise $1 billion for $4 billion without even a product, then you have to sell for 8 or 10, right, to actually have a reasonable outcome for everybody. And that in my head makes this whole story, having done this now multiple times, both in a bootstrap and VC setting, it's not so easy to get there. And I think if you're very diligent, if you have 3-4 smart people, I think if not now, when you really have this 10x capabilities, right, with all of the agents that you can run in the background on coding themselves, I think you just need the right idea and you need the right problem definition. And I think that's something that Johannes always preaches as well. If you look at just deep learning models and how they are trained, right? And I think it applies very much to the company that we've built. As long as you frame the right hypothesis of the problem that you want to solve in the input and the output, ultimately, being it on the company level or on the model layer, you will find a solution. But the most difficult thing is to define it and not to do it ultimately. And I think this is where I think we've been fortunate over the last 17 months to ultimately work on the right things.
I wonder, why did you then decide to actually raise funds in the first place? Because you were basically profitable from the first order. You have done the bootstrap way before. Why was raising funds, and 15 million, I think it's the biggest seed round that was ever done in Austria so far. Why was that the right strategy for you guys?
Because we knew we couldn't hold that, right? Because I think we've never wanted to become a solution/service organization. And to do groundbreaking research, we knew that we could get maybe 1 to 2 more customers in that size, but obviously we didn't know when and how, right? So I think it was kind of a first proof point. So having the mental flexibility of not giving a about money is very fulfilling in the way how you steer the organization. I mean, at the point now where we signed the paper with Mistral, we still have 2 years runway, right? So technically, it wouldn't be needed. But I think if we've trained a large model to have the capability to just go, let's spend $1 million, I think gives you a lot of mental flexibility of focusing on the right things. And we had this discussion, right, in the seed round, like, isn't this a little too much, right? Don't we want to dilute less? I think all fair questions, right? But I think just for the mental sanity, I would generally say, I think, I don't know if like 12 or 18 is the right amount, right? But I think to have this, like, you can run for 3 years with the best people without really focusing on, okay, have to save cost, I think gives you the freedom that you need to think about what's important.
No. Yeah, makes a ton of sense. And often people, when they think about AI models, they also associate very high costs with it. I mean, you look at the mega rounds, right, that Anthropic or Open AI are raising or have raised, and there's just so much money being poured in that. Is that also one thing that you're like, hey, maybe we actually need more money because of all the investments we need to make into the AI space itself? Of course, it's a very different probably training than the big guys there, but at the same time, it's probably also quite cost intense, I assume, from the outside.
It is, but comparatively low, I would say. So, I mean, when we train models, we train them on multiple nodes. So one node is 8 GPUs, right? But not on thousands of GPUs, which I think in the case of the work models or the general purpose models, you have to have hundred thousands of GPUs that you train it. So cluster cost in our case is a reasonable 6-digit amount per month, like whatever you can call reasonable 6-digit amount, right? But I think it's comparatively okay. But it was honestly, I mean, it was an argument to join forces with Mistral. It was not the core argument. I think for us, the big mental discussion we had both in the founding team and with the board was we've actually been raising our Series A. As of January, we had the term sheets on the table, and we knew that the equity story that we would have to drive is to transform Emmi from a research-led organization into a research-led but go-to-market proof organization. And I think one of the hardest things that I've seen in the past is changing culture and focus of even if it's a small organization, right? Of in our case, 35 people, but to make go-to-market a muscle in a company where the muscle just didn't exist, like zero, right? We've just built cool shit ultimately, is not an easy task. And so the discussion we had internally is like, so obviously we would have raised 50 million and this would have been possible. But with the 50 million, you have 2 to 3 years kind of going forward of building the muscle. What do you gain? What's the certainty? What's the opportunity cost of this kind of versus, and I mean, with Mistral, we basically have the best go-to-market organization in Europe, right, with roughly 500 people in solutions with CEO access to every big enterprise. Wouldn't it make more sense for us to keep the identity, but join a bigger ship and then just accelerate with that? And I think this was talking to Arturo and Guillaume and Tim on the Mistral side, I think was the ultimate decision factor to say, hey, you want to go into industrial engineering, right? We had overlapping customers, even with them, and had a partnership discussion. You would save yourself 1.5 years, get a mega equity story now. We basically just have a win-win because we can continue what we do with more resources, while at the same time, we can now work with the biggest companies in the world on their big problems. Doesn't it make sense to team up? And I think then ultimate decision was like, yes, it makes sense.
How was that conversation initiated? Like, obviously you had some overlapping customers, etc., but was it you originally approaching them? Were they approaching you? Or how did you get to know each other in the first place?
So we had initial conversations, I think this dated back to Q3 2025, more on technology partnerships. So Mistral basically having customers in our field wanting to understand how we solve these problems and if it doesn't make sense to use our technology. So, but these were more, I would say, strategic operational discussions about integrating from a tech perspective. And when we embarked on the Series A raise, I mean, as you know, we see, how do you say, the chattiness is always there. Obviously, I mean, all of our competitors, as much as the AI labs, got to know that we are on the market, right? Fundraising, because it's just everybody's invested everywhere, and then the news spreads in a way. So while receiving term sheets for the round, we actually started to receive as well offers for mergers and acquisitions and the transaction. And that then as well spread the news until a point where Mistral approached us and said, hey, doesn't it make sense to, I mean, one, meet in person, maybe talk a little bit more about the strategic partnership, and then two, this moving into just negotiations about an LOI. So it was actually a competitive process between the financing round and the acquisition, and then within the acquisition, different parties that were involved.
I want to get to that with the next question. So it's clear why you sort of sold in that moment, only after 18 months of building the company. You wanted to double down on the research, and it was sort of a lot of synergies with a strong player, with a strong commercial team in that sense. You mentioned other players. So obviously Mistral isn't the only one that you could have sold to. Once you decided, okay, it's time to sell and not do the funding round, what other players were in the race? Were there also some from the other continent, like the big players like OpenAI, Anthropic, etc., talking to you about a potential acquisition?
Yes, I mean, we basically, in this is kind of I would say the natural thing that we have to make sure as founders, as well as duty to the investors, is that we talk to everybody ultimately, right? I mean, so there was both inbound and outbound on the topic, and we had conversations with everybody and multiple offers on the table. But at the same time, I mean, it's always a bit of a reflection as well of what do you think is the right thing to do, and where do you personally think you would land the best, right? And would have the most identification what the people are doing with, right? Does it make sense to move to the US, right, with a family? Do you want that? Although it might have benefited the bank account, right? I mean, is this something you admire to do going forward? So I think these were all the discussions that ultimately factored in. And I mean, I think we've even if you're very, I think, into the research scene, you naturally are quite closely connected to all of the big labs, right? So we lost one of our best people like a year ago to Google, right? Prometheus is like one of the biggest labs now in our field, basically funded by Bezos. Anthropic is now slowly going into verticalized structure as well, next to all of the, I think, more general purpose models that they have. You have Cohere, not to forget, right? Now with the connection into Germany as well, with the acquisition of Aleph. So it's everybody's trying to make business out of AI. And I think industrial AI will be one of the next big frontiers.
But then if I hear you correctly, you did have other offers on the table that might have even had a higher valuation on the table to sell to, but you did not decide to go for them. How do you make that decision? Because in the end, you have investors, they want to see a return, right? And I assume, thinking a bit like the cliche Europe versus the US, we'll talk about more of that later. It's also a bit of where do you see the odds of success higher to then materialize in such a deal? And if you would go with Anthropic or OpenAI, I would argue from an investor perspective, they might see more upside there or more chances of actually getting the liquidity out at one point.
Yeah, I think so. The judgment obviously is done based on the facts that you mentioned. But I think ultimately what you look at is two things from a financial perspective, right? One is what's the immediate de-risking that I get, and the other one is what's the upside going forward, right? And I think where I'm with you, if we would bet on who will be the winning general purpose company in the world, right, you might pick a different company, because I think clearly in Anthropic or in Google are leading the race on this one. If you look at their valuations, though, that they have, right, because it's a part share, part cash deal, you have to get shares for the valuation that you have. I think Anthropic now is at 900 billion, if I'm not mistaken. Right? I mean, Google obviously is at, I don't know, 4 trillion or so in stock listed. Mistral, and I think this is public information, is currently at 12 billion, if I'm not mistaken. Right. So where do you have more upside? And who do you bet on ultimately? And I think this was then where we felt like, okay, if we combine the upside and the belief, and I think most important in all of the non-financial thing is your gut feeling on, who do you engage with and do you trust the leaders of the organization? So I think I would always rate Arthur by margin over any of the CEOs of the other companies across the pond. Then I think you make the call, right? And I think, yes, we've had a lot of discussion with our board and with our investors about it. Ultimately, it's a founder's decision, right? Because if we make a call, we want to go there, and this is the offer we're going to take. Like, who wants to object, right? So the maximum you will get from us is a middle finger, right? But not the direction change.
Absolutely. But I love that perspective, because I think many times people from the outside think, oh, it's just about the price. But no, there's so many other different factors that play a role, like moving your family to the US, something that you guys might not be willing or wanting to do. So it makes a lot of sense to look at it from all different angles to then reach such an important decision. You mentioned Arthur, right? So you met in person. 10 days later, the deal was clear. Okay, we're going to do this. What happened in these 10 days? How was the interaction? How did you talk and sort of structure the deal together in these 10 days to reach that decision?
I mean, so the first meeting was more a get to know, right? And I think the get clarity about the intent of the offer and the structure, and as well giving them a bit of a feeling on what we can bring to the table, which they partially knew from the discussions we had before, but as well as I think our expectations to the deal, right, in terms of size, cash versus shares, involvement going forward, and then the same from the other side. So what's the intent of Mistral, and just getting this a little bit structured. And I think so. It ended, I think, in the first meeting at a point where we were like, okay, this actually could be a nice opportunity, so let's explore it further. And usually in transaction processes, the one thing you look at is term sheets or LOIs, depending on how you look at it, right? So you ultimately look at the core terms that you have in the discussion. So I think from then we basically had daily discussions about terms, right? Which then naturally are negotiation as well in between the other parties. So you obviously try to leverage the deal, right, and get the best out of it for you as much as the other party is obviously willing to, from the numbers perspective. And I think once we did more of a verbal handshake, you basically start to work out the LOI, and we've basically flown to Paris, I think, for the last 3 days before we signed the LOI, which was eight weeks ago, where we basically just locked ourselves into a room, right? And then it was like, okay, you go LOI, so basically as you would raise a fund, right? So you go through every term. It's very similar to a fundraising process from a structure perspective, right? So you define the terms. Obviously, you have different things that you look more for, because things like clawbacks, warranties are more important in an exit than they are in a kind of venture capital round, kind of which is more forward related. But the process is very much the same. And then we signed the LOI, and we knew that we wanted to close within we wanted to sign in 4 to 6 weeks. But obviously at this point, you haven't gone through tax, right? You haven't gone through the approvals. So we needed about 8 weeks, I think, from LOI to signing.
Okay. But that's still pretty fast, I would say.
It's still so exactly with all of the due diligence happening, right? All of the legal discussions. I think for the deal size, the time was actually very, very well done, and kudos to Mick, I think, on our side, who led the process. And now I think it's roughly 3 weeks, hopefully, between signing and closing, right? And then at closing, basically everything is done.
Let's also talk about the deal structure. You hinted there is obviously a share component to also have the upside, but there was also a cash component. How do you structure that? How do you split the two percentage-wise? What was sort of the deal structure behind all of this?
Yeah, I can unfortunately not go into that on this one because it's under the confidentiality. But I think maybe generally speaking, I mean, obviously this is part of the negotiation, right? So technically there's always an incentive to say, I want to have a reasonable de-risk, while the de-risk needs to be weighted with the forward opportunity. And then you have the Mistral side or the other side that is buyer that usually tries to solely incentivize you, which is kind of classic kind of negotiation, right, on equity. So ultimately, I think you land at a point where it just makes sense for both sides, where you have reasonably enough forward incentive, and obviously it's more from a buyer side the easier thing to give, right? Where you at the same time you want to have, specifically for the investors, not even for us, you want to have your money back, and you want to tell a proper story to your investors at the same time.
I know you cannot go into details, but I just tried to sneak out some information from you. Did you, as founders, get some, how would you say, life-changing money in cash out of it?
I can philosophically answer that. I think so we're well off, but we've been, I think, all well off before.
Okay, right? That's fair. Yeah.
from a structure. So I think it will, for none of us, in not talking about the amounts, I think more about what we'll do with it, will not change our lives. Right? So we'll not buy a Lamborghini and drive around with it, neither a helicopter or an island. I think we're all, not speaking for the other two though, I think quite happy with our lives. And from that perspective, I mean, obviously it's a great deal for everyone, like no question. But I think it should not be life-changing, because then you might have done something wrong before, right? I mean, not saying, I mean, if you founded multiple companies, it might be a wrong statement. But yeah, I think if you're an entrepreneur, you do it for the journey and not for the end.
Yeah. And knowing you could have 100 billion X, and I think your lives wouldn't really change much, you know?
I will still fly economy Europe because I don't understand why people fly business continental.
Doesn't make sense. Then from the investor perspective, like there was obviously the 15 million seed round. So the investors, did they get the cash back or even more than they invested in cash and now also the upside, or how was that structure?
They got a reasonable X on everything. Yeah, unfortunately, I cannot say more, Sylvan. So I think that everybody should be happy as well from an LP perspective with the deal.
Beautiful. Because that's important, right? But I would not have any other expectations from you, that you take care of everyone involved in a very nice way.
And you have to do, I think the worst thing that can happen in such a deal is that you have someone who sneaks out, right? Or kind of tries to go against it. So, I mean, obviously, I think it's fair to say that there's never everybody the same opinion at the beginning of the process, but it's super important that at some point everybody disagrees and commit or disagrees and comments, right? Because otherwise you just fuck up the whole process. And the worst thing that the buyer wants is a company that has, I don't know, law cases or unhappy people that don't want to do it. So we try to make sure that I think everybody gets, including the employees, actually, everybody gets their fair share.
Very good. Then there were rumors in the press on Tuesday when the article sort of broke and the news broke that the whole acquisition valuation could approach 1 billion euros. Can you comment on that? Is that number real?
I don't know. I mean, you're trying to hit the same point all the time, Sevan.
I know.
Which I
it's my job,
appreciate. No, but yeah, I think unfortunately this is, if I would say anything to it, I think I would immediately get a WhatsApp from Archie. So I'll restrain from it.
We leave that big number in the room, but we also take note that you do not deny it. Let's put it that way.
This is your interpretation, Silva.
That's good. We take that. So let's now focus on what happens now. Of course, you're now in the closing phase. So that's going to be another intense phase, but you're staying on. Obviously, that was also a very important part of the whole deal. What will your role within Mistral now look like? What are the next sort of priorities and tasks that you and the whole Emmi AI team will focus on?
Yeah, so what we basically do, and this was the discussion even in the first meeting that we had with Arthur and team, was that what they need is ultimately a team that creates a new vertical or builds up the existing vertical, but faster than they've been until now. So Emmi will ultimately become Mistral Industrial Engineering, and we'll split the company. I think focus the company on two parts. One is continue the fundamental research that we've been doing, which obviously will be led by Johannes, kind of within the Mistral context. And the other thing is kind of serving the big customers with the capabilities that we have, right? Which will be more Mick, Mai, and the team's kind of focus on the solution side. So Emmi will be a vertical within the organization. Obviously, we have to integrate. So there are some functions who are not vertical anymore going forward, like people in finance, for example. But exactly, so we'll be on VP level roles within the big organization.
Nice. Is there a specific duration that you guys have to stay on, like legally?
There are two ways how to structure that, right? And I think specifically as this deal is tech and people acquisition, if you want to say it this way, you usually don't use earnouts, right? Because it's hard to measure going forward. So you usually use reverse vestings to ultimately kind of commit not only the founding team, but as well as the employees, reasonably incentivize them going forward. So, I mean, with the deal, we knew that this would be part of it, right? So I think we three in the team believes in the journey. So that's the reason why we said, okay, as we believe in the journey, we're happy to commit. And obviously it's part of the deal.
You mentioned that there's potential in industrial AI applications. Obviously, that's also what you now try to lift the synergies together with Mistral. Which specific industry applications do you see the most potential in?
For different answers to that, I think one answer may be more tied to the market potential and the revenue potential, and one answer may be more tied to, I think, where the capabilities lie today and what might be the easiest frontiers. Right? So I think if you just purely look at where, from an industrial perspective, most of the value is created at the moment and what the most kind of fast-growing industry verticals are, it's clearly silicon. Right? So there's nothing that beats anything around chips at the moment. And I think what you have to have in mind is chips is not only GPUs, right? So GPUs need CPUs to function. CPUs need SSD, RAM, right, to store the stuff. You need the connections in between. You need the data centers that ultimately host that, and you need the energy that serves them and it makes the GPUs kind of infer. So I think this by margin is the biggest industry at the moment and the fastest growing. I think the second biggest in industrial applications at the moment is defense. It's a bit fortunate, unfortunate, right? Because obviously there are bad reasons for this being kind of a frontier where there's a lot of money going in. But I think these two I would clearly highlight when you just look at pure market cap potential, right? At the same time, obviously, they are very, how to say, I think they're tricky to model from a physics perspective because on silicon, you really go into nanometers, right, of scale, which is not like I crash a car against the wall and, let's see how it deforms. So it's just more nitty gritty, and you even have problems to classically simulate that from a structural perspective. While on defense, yeah, I think usually it's more thermal and aerodynamics applications that you look at, right? Because you want the rockets to go faster, to make less noise, to, I don't know, produce less radar kind of deflection, right? Whatever problem you're trying to optimize. So I think these are the biggest markets. I think the most advanced industrial applications today you clearly find in automotive. And it's both mechanical stresses, which is around crash testings and drivetrains, and in everything Formula One aerodynamics, right? So I think because these are the fields where you have most of the data and the most sophisticated solvers and know-how available on how to reproduce that. So it doesn't really match, right? But I think so what we did as Emmi is basically we focused the research on the areas which are the furthest, and we try to focus the customer things on the biggest markets, because these are obviously the companies who are willing to pay a decent amount of money for big projects, while at the same time, if you today chase a contract in automotive, might not be the best place to be honest.
A bit more challenging these days.
Exactly.
Dennis, also now you joining forces, maybe one last sort of outlook question. Now the trajectory is sort of clear, at least it seems from the outside. IPO is the goal.
I think it's the only goal that you can have being Mistral, right? And I'm not even saying this because I have any insights into what Arthur is planning, but I'm saying this more from an outsider's perspective, right? Because what do you think is the chance that Anthropic will buy Mistral? Right.
I don't know. Yeah.
I can tell you that there will be at least how many countries are in Europe, ex-governance, that will object against this deal. So you will have no chance to do that, right? So I think, and it's not something secretive ultimately. I think this was told as well in the press. I think the only way you have towards this exit is kind of building a champion, but that ideally is not just solely built on sovereignty and being in a legislation, or because that, I think ultimately you want to be the best and not the best in Europe, but I think the intent here is to build leading and frontier AI out of Europe for the world.
I love that. And that brings me to the last sort of broader topic that I want to address with you, because you're incredibly, not as an entrepreneur only, you are also an incredible thinker and a smart guy. So I want to talk about Europe and the bigger picture when it comes to the whole tech world. So Arthur actually recently said that Europe has 2 years to avoid becoming America's vassal state in AI. I think it's also a bit of a, quite a bold statement. Do you buy that framing? And does this acquisition actually move the needle in that sense to sort of hopefully avoid that?
So, I mean, I think where he's right is that the race of, or in, let's say, frontiers, let's call it standard AI, right, about language vision, it will be hard to regain kind of a leading position, right? Because I think specifically US and China is so far advanced. I think the bet that we have, and that's part of the teaming up, is that in engineering, in everything that really matters from a geographical perspective, right? So most of the wealth from Europe is born out of industrial applications, and the capabilities in engineering, and not software, but non-software engineering that we have, that this is our home turf and we shouldn't lose this battle. And I think we need to buckle up, because we've seen, I mean, Prometheus is just, I think they're in the process of raising 10 billion at the moment, right? It's one of our competitors. Good luck to compete, right? So, I mean, obviously they will not be as efficient with the money than we would have ever been, right? But it doesn't matter if you have 10 billion, right, and you compete. So I think this is a bit, I think, because they obviously, and the US is only interested in creating winners, right? I think we've been always, as a geography, being as well okay to create winners in specific segments, or maybe even being okay with being second. I think, I'm not sure if AI will allow you for that, to be honest, right? Because I think the bigger one will, and you see this now with this huge push of Claude in the last 3-4 months, right, of features, capabilities. I don't know who will be capable at all to compete with them kind of going forward. And maybe Google, because I think they have the resources to do that, right? But I think from an integration perspective, it's just crazy what they've delivered. So I think there is a lot of truth in the statement, while this truth means as well that there needs to be commitment, right? And I think this is a bit what I was asking in between the lines from everybody, which we've, as Emmys, have seen firsthand. But I mean, we're an Austrian-based company. We've always had a lot of support from Austrian government, etc. We have 0 Austrian customers, and it's unfortunate because Austria, just taking this as an example now, has quite some billion-dollar companies that can actually afford to as well push frontier solutions into their products. But they've been hesitant so far because most of them rather want to be fast followers than leaders, right? And I think this is a big thing, and something that I think specifically France did very well in the last 3-4 years, where they ultimately pushed and forced big enterprises to work with startups, right? I think the easiest way to create an ecosystem is have your enterprises work with the startups, pay, not invest. Like, nobody gives a about your startup program. Like, just to be frank, right? Nobody wants to have a 20,000 POC with your startup program lead. I want to have $1 million contract that really helps you make and drive change in the core of your business. And this is I think the mentality, I would say, specifically in the German-speaking market, that I think we have to get to.
That's one of the many reasons why I love doing interviews with you, because you're very direct and very right in what you say. You don't try to sugarcoat it. I love that you are calling what it is, basically. And with that perspective, like, okay, we see the industrial applications are home to Europe, especially outside of software engineering. However, could you then argue, well, with all the money being invested and spent in the US and all the sort of big frontier models being there, will it not just be easier for them to then come over Europe and sort of adapt their frontier model to that use case compared to trying to develop the niche here in Europe ourselves?
It could be. I mean, I don't think so. What you have to have in mind with AI is that these models, we are far away from AGI, and these models only function in the given training problem that you use them, right? So I think the training problem can be text in, text out, right? image in action out, right? And everything like being in delays, being in audio, video, whatever. It's basically you train a model on a task and then it's capable to execute on a task in the given frame that you give it. And I think that's the limitation, right? So even if your general purpose models are getting better, they only get better in, text out. And obviously that's one of the most important things to increase productivity at the moment, because there's a lot on software engineering and blue and white collar workers, right? But give Claude, I don't know, Opus a geometry and ask it what will happen when, I don't know, you heat the stuff up. It has no idea about it. So I think, and this is where we can differentiate ultimately, right? I'm not saying that we will always be better and will always lead in the field, but I think we have a clear domain depth and expertise advantage on these fields. And because the reason why US is performing that well is because of software engineering, right? Not because of hardware engineering. And I think we have to utilize that.
I love that. And if you look back at Austria, not long ago, we also had Peter Steinberger, who built OpenClaw and sort of took over the whole internet, at least for a few weeks. And then he made quite an interesting move. He actually moved to San Francisco to join OpenAI. And that is sort of, if you look at it, there are two perspectives on it, right? So first is, what is Austria doing right that others like Switzerland can learn from Austria, that you have produced two crazy success cases in such a short amount of time? Like, there seems to be the right ingredients, the right environment, or at least something that is done right, that you generate this output in Austria in such a short amount of time between two success stories.
I think so. I think structurally, looking at the two scenes and being now on Swisspreneur podcast, I honestly think that I think Switzerland is better structured than Austria at the moment, at least from the field that you look at, right? And the breadth and depth of the technology that you have with, at minimum 2 world-leading universities with ETH and EPFL, a lot of, I think, very good second-tier universities, a lot of spin-offs. You have quite good seed Series A financing now with, finally, but it comes together. And there's a reason why it comes together, because there are more and more exits, right? So it looks like there's a flywheel starting. I think I see the flywheel, I would generally say, a bit less in Austria at the moment. I think you have maybe a bit more highlights, if you want to say it this way, but not so much consistency. And I think the consistency is what will win it long term, at least at the moment. So therefore, I think my general bet would be more on Switzerland. I think Austria has amazing research and amazing universities, but is lacking a bit this international entrepreneurial mindset. And I hope that it slowly kind of comes to the table. I mean, and to Peter, I know him well, so I don't want to comment too much, because we've been both in the PDF ecosystem for quite some time together. I think he was just, and this is my interpretation without quoting him, right? I mean, he searched for a mental home for himself and for the work that he's been doing. And I think there was honestly no home that could fulfill the potential and the ambition that he had, which is the reason why he has chosen, OpenAI as a path. Because honestly, specifically for what he has been doing with OpenClaw, in my head, I wouldn't have seen any opportunity in Europe that could fulfill this kind of dream and focus. So there was a lot of criticism against him on that move, specifically in Austria. I don't see this too much. I mean, right, I think he was searching, and I think he did a TED talk as well in Vancouver about his entrepreneurial kind of path, right? Kind of falling into, which I've seen personally with him as well, kind of into a hole after selling his company to his PDF kit, and then kind of searching for purpose, right? And then kind of finding the purpose. So, obviously, if you have such a deal on the table, you pick it. So I think it's, as entrepreneurs, you're opportunistic, right? So you have an identity and you have a culture, but would AfD become, I don't know, or put the prime minister in Germany? Like, I wouldn't give a fuck about Germany. right? So it's like you build a company where you're capable to build it. And yes, you have constraints and you have culture and you have heritage and you have tradition that you all have to factor into it, but you follow the opportunity.
Yeah, and with that move, I think he also put out a post on X where he was pretty clearly, like just paraphrasing here, saying that, hey, what I want to build, it would simply be not possible in Europe to a certain degree. So the US is the right place for him to be in this very moment.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I also want, talk about a bit the uncomfortable question, a bit about the scaling from Europe. We already briefly touched up on it with the hyperscalers, but also the big frontier models all in the US. So the big question is now, okay, IPO is the clear goal of Mistral. And in Europe, can you actually scale to those levels that you need to have? I mean, obviously you can, there are public companies, but like from where you want to go, is it even possible to build that, what you're trying to build now? Or is it still like too hard to eventually achieve it, to go public and build a really big, meaningful company out of Europe while staying in Europe?
So I think at this scale, what we're trying, it's unproven. Right? I wouldn't generally say that it's impossible. I mean, obviously you have hurdles from European Parliament perspective, right, from an AI Act perspective, etc. I think energy plays a big important role in the whole equation, because I think it's more and more becoming a race for energy rather than a race for compute, because it's the biggest cost driver for everything that you're doing in AI. I still truly believe that it's possible. Otherwise, we would never embarked on the journey. But it will not be an easy ride, and we might be wrong. So let's talk in 2-3 years, and then I can tell you more. I think it's worth a challenge, and I think if and this is the ambition ultimately. I mean, there are stock listed large scale companies, right? Being at, I don't know, Zalando, there are a lot of companies before, right, around the Stripes in the Wises of the world. Is there one in just sole AI yet, or AI native? I don't think so. And I think this is ultimately what we're embarking on.
And don't get me wrong, I really admire and appreciate that you guys stay in Europe and you generate value here in Europe. I think that's very important to still stay relevant, because if all the best talent would leave to the US, I mean, where would we be left in 2-3 years, right? So thank you for doing that. And looking a bit into the future, I know we talked about sort of the doomsday. Okay, Europe is like embarking on a difficult path, maybe, but where do you see the future of Europe in 3 years? Because you said energy is very important. I think there were probably some difficult or wrong decisions, especially in Germany, when it comes to that, to actually have enough energy to power that infrastructure. And very simplified, you could probably say energy equals intelligence in the sort of era that we live in now. So where do you see Europe in 3 years?
I mean, so I think we shouldn't forget that a lot of the technology that we need to create this intelligence actually is born out of Europe, right? I mean, you have ASML as the I think most valuable company now in Europe, if I'm not mistaken, what enabling this whole thing with the lithography kind of technology that they have and their big machines. So we have a fair share, but I think we need bolder investments. And I think these investments, and I agree with you, Silvan, I think mostly tie into energy. Right? I mean, I think Switzerland has a fairly good stand, right? Because you have, I think, the geology for it that makes up for it a little bit. And I think France has a good stand in there. I think Sweden, Norway, etc. as well, because they made some bold decisions in the past. But they're definitely kind of countries who have problems to scale it. And I think that will just hurt more going forward, right, if you don't invest. So I think I reckon and valued specifically in Germany, the initiative, I think, of Merz of investing a lot into infrastructure. I think it got stuck a little bit. So I think my hope is that I think the boldness comes back a little bit in the importance of that, and not, sleeping for too long to then miss the train ultimately and completely going broke. Because what you see now in the US, that every data center basically gets its own gas turbine. And because it's, I think it's just the way how it functions at the moment, right? I think what the B200s at the moment, the graphic card is, I think, 1,200 watts. water cooled, right? I think the new ones that are coming are north of 2000, if I'm not mistaken. So you can put the same amount of GPUs in the rack, but you need double the energy, right? And I think it's gonna be a challenge. But I'm hopeful. I think if you look at the talent density, the research that we're doing, I think we have a fair chance of leading the pack and being frontier. We just need to ride it till the end.
I wanted to say, because it sounds a bit that we're very good with the talent and with the research, but then we're pretty bad at the commercialization part and also capturing the value of the technologies that we create or drive. And we often leave that to the Americans by either selling too early or just not having the market cap and the investments to back it up. So it sounds a bit like we do a lot of the heavy lifting, but we're not getting paid in full for all that groundwork, and we leave a lot of potential on the table.
I don't know. So I'm not necessarily sure. So I think if you just look at, let's say, stock market value, I'd maybe back the hypothesis, right? Because obviously Nasdaq, everything around is the biggest trade market. While at the same time, if you look at what are the biggest Google DeepMind offices right next to San Francisco, it's like London and Zurich, ultimately, right? And Paris now kind of growing quite quickly. So I think as an economy, we actually get a fair share even from the value that is created. Like, sometimes I have the feeling that this stock price index races in comparison is a bit of an unfair comparison, because still most of the values if the value is created in Europe and we get some of the value, not the shareholder value, but more the economic value, it's still fine, right? I mean, I don't care ultimately. I think what shouldn't happen is that basically the economic value goes away as well while we are creating a lot of the market value, if you want to say it this way. But we live in a global world at the same time. So I think up to a certain extent, we have to accept it, I would generally say, but we shouldn't lose the ground. So I think, yeah. So, but I think it's all about this boldness and investing, right? So because it's still, if you look at the amounts that are invested into the big AI frontier labs over the pond and here or even in Asia, it's different. And this is all about capabilities, right? So have the money to invest into more compute, more resources, more talent, better talent to ultimately crack whatever you want to crack.
And that probably either needs this flywheel to get bigger and bigger, or political will and doubling down on making the bold calls on a political level to activate the funds to make that happen, or a mix of both, probably.
I think it's a mix of everything, right? I mean, I personally would never want to rely on governments to fix problems. No, but I think it has to be, it has to come in a way from everybody, right? I think big companies having the capabilities and the boldness to sign big contracts with local smaller startups, right? It has to come from, yes, retirement funds investing into VC funds. It's one element out of it. It has to come from the government investing into, all of the great universities and allowing the best people to do research, funded mostly, obviously, from governmental money and from tax money, to then kind of have the next leap, and then the whole ecosystem to grow, in mindset and the mentor she sets, if you want to say it this way, that helps it, which I think there are definitely great ecosystems. Like, I mean, Zurich clearly is one, right? You have Munich, you have Paris that are nurturing at the moment. So let's keep the momentum.
For sure. Dennis, I also prepared some rapid fire questions for you to sort of spice things up a bit. I'm just going to fire right away, okay?
Shoot.
What was the hardest part of building Emmi AI that nobody really talks about?
I think data from our side, right? Because our still biggest problem is that we don't have available data that we can train the models on, right? We're basically train intelligence from ground up. So the only way how to get there is to create it synthetically yourself, because no other company would grant you access to their data and let general purpose model train on it. So I think the whole data topic about, what geometries, what type of physical problems, how to create inputs, outputs, I think is the the biggest bottleneck that we still face today.
What is one decision that you'd make differently if you started all over again? Because you've seen many companies and built many things. Now, everything you know, one thing you do differently.
I don't know actually what I would do different. So because you compound ultimately, right? The learnings. I think looking back, yes, there would have definitely be decisions, right? To sell this company earlier, not sell this company because you've known how the macro stuff basically evolved, right? Or maybe I don't know, not be too opinionated and hold back from certain things because it had negative impact and long term. But these are learnings that compound. And I think this, ultimately is part of the personality as well. So I wouldn't call out one thing, to be honest, that, is this thing that I always would do different. I think everything happens for a reason. And as long as you learn from it, it's going to be fine.
I like the compounding thing. Everything compounds. Learnings, investments, relationships, everything. I love that.
That's the reason why you should start a startup and not work in a corporate.
I agree, definitely. I know it's not going to be a Ferrari or a Lamborghini, but what's the first thing that you're doing with the money that you make now that has nothing to do with startups? Do you go on any vacation or anything that you're going to do with it?
I actually bought a lawnmower, an automatic one. The most sophisticated one I can find, which I can steer over an app and over Cloud, to not be in the need to mow the lawn anymore every second weekend.
You're going crazy, man. Unbelievable.
I know. But I can tell you, it actually it gives me back 3 hours a week.
So well, that's a good investment. Yeah, I'm surprised you haven't done that already in the past.
Yeah, I know. But I actually enjoy it as well as a task. But now I think we went into this thing has to be automated.
Nice. What is the most underrated AI lab in Europe right now that nobody pays attention to?
I think a big fan of everything what is happening in robotics at the moment. It's a different field where we don't have any connections to it, but they're trying to chase kind of similar problems. And if that can be cracked, it has similar big impact than what we're trying to do in industrial engineering. So I think I would definitely lean into this being, and I think references to, for example, the Mimica is in Zurich. This is something that I would look at, which is, I think from a topic perspective, it's overrepresented. But if you look at the companies, I think the impact long-term will be massive.
And who is a founder in Europe that you think will build or is building something very meaningful as much as Emmi and Mistral?
But I don't know. You what is this VC advice and who to invest next?
Just someone you're impressed with or you like.
Well, there are a lot of people actually. I would generally say I'm impressed with. So it's really hard to mention this one. I think now at my mental state, and I think what what we are trying to achieve going forward with the IPO, I think I'm technically leaning more into big scale-ups as the ones that I'm personally more attached to, right? So I think the Zalandos and the Wises of the world, and kind of being the big stories of how to handle that growth and bring a company public, make it a very recurringly sustainable business. So yeah, I think just from a mental perspective, I think this is where I'm more focused on at the moment.
Makes sense. And the last one for you today, when people look back at this deal in 10 years, what do you want them to say it changed or its lasting impact is?
Oh, I mean, so what we want is to really help this next industrial revolution, right? So I think if we look back in 10 years and say, I think we had our fair share of impact, whatever this impact will be, into driving the intelligence industrial revolution, if you want to say it this way, then I'd be super proud.
I love that. Dennis, I really, really appreciate you coming back. It's always a pleasure with you. I remember the first episode that we recorded at your offices and it went on for 2 hours. you came to our Swisspreneur Scale Up Cruise events, and you're always there to sort of invest time, give back, inspire the next generation. I really appreciate it because it's not a given. So thank you for that, and we wish you all the best and lots of success. Thank you.
Thanks.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, you can support us by rating our show on Apple Podcasts. This way, we can reach an ever-growing number of aspiring entrepreneurs.